Yeah. Everything is recorded.
And then there was a lot of, I wrote today, but I didn't keep track of it. You got a jersey like empty street. No, it's fine. Ken Kellner. He is visiting us from West Virginia University, and he got his PhD and master's at Purdue with Rob Swihart. He studied small mammal activity and seed dispersal, and I think he published, like, I tried to count the number of papers today, but it was really hard. I think 10 came from his PhD, and more are coming out from the postdoc, and it's humbling and terrible to look at his Google Scholar profile page. And he used a 100-year harvest experiment as a study system to do that work, and he's recently been hired to do more fancy modeling for another 100-year harvest experiment. So, welcome. And I also convinced him to give an intro art workshop tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. for grad students that need to build skills in that way, in that area. So we're really grateful to have him here, and welcome. Take it away.
Thank you, Carmen. Yeah, I'm excited to be here and to talk about my research. Before I start, I just wanted to thank everybody that I've interacted with today. You guys have been incredibly friendly. It's been really great to visit here and talk to everybody. So my talk is titled Wildlife and Managed Forests, Demographic Patterns and Trophic Interactions. And this is basically a fancy title I put together to smush together two different projects that I wanted to talk about at the same time. So hopefully it makes sense together. So I'm going to talk a little bit generally about forest management and and the timber harvest I'm going to be talking about throughout this talk. And I realize that probably a lot of people in this crowd are foresters and know all this stuff cold. But I'm going to kind of give a brief overview of it anyway, just to make sure that we're all on the same page with what when I say a silvicultural term, to make sure you all know what I'm talking about. So I apologize if this is like really basic information to you, but I think it's worth going over. So here in defining forest management is changing the structure of the age of a forest, and you can do that a variety of different ways. The way that is people often think of first is timber harvesting, where you're going in and you're actually removing individual trees, and this you can have a lot of reasons for doing this. You might be harvesting them for economic reasons, to make money. You might be trying to create habitat for a particular wildlife species. You might be trying to improve the health of the forest or to promote the regeneration of a particular tree, which is what the system I worked in was aimed at. There's a lot of reasons, and timber harvesting is one approach, and obviously there's a million different ways of timber harvesting, and I'll talk about a few of them. Another really interesting component of forest management is controlled burns. I find the impacts of controlled burns to be fascinating. Unfortunately, the systems I worked in, they hadn't started doing controlled burns, so I'm not going to talk much about them today, but these sites where I worked are now starting to have controlled burns included into their management regime, so I'm hoping that there'll be some interesting stuff to come out of that in the future. So I'm going to focus on timber harvests. So obviously, timber harvesting, removal of trees, in this case, is going to have major impacts on the forest ecosystem. And I'm going to start with the obvious abiotic effects. Light, of course, is the first one that comes to mind. If you remove a tree from the canopy, you are creating a hole in that canopy in which light is going to come through. And when that light reaches the forest floor, things are going to change. So there's going to be more light available for growth, and that's also going to change climate conditions, moisture and temperature specifically. And it depends on where you are in the country or the world, what exactly changes, but at least in the system I was working in, typically if you create a canopy opening and more light reaches the forest floor, you're going to see more extremes in both moisture and temperature because, in the winter, sites without a canopy are exposed, they're going to be colder, but in the summer, they're maybe getting more direct sun, so they're going to be hotter, and more water is going to reach the forest floor from rainfall if there's no canopy, but it's also going to dry out faster potentially in the summer if there's more direct sun. And of course, these impacts are going to depend on how long it's been since the timber harvesting occurred. But clearly, there are going to be major abiotic shifts. And those abiotic changes are in turn going to have biotic effects as well. And one of the obvious things that changes very quickly, depending on the type of timber harvest, is the understory vegetation layer. So, in most older forests, there'll be plants in the understory, at least in eastern U.S. forests, but not necessarily dense vegetation. Unless you have a big invasive problem. But usually once you cut down the overstory trees, you're going to pretty quickly, within a couple of years, have an extremely dense understory layer. And that suite of species is going to be both more dense and the species present are going to be different. And that's going to potentially change food availability for a wide variety of wildlife. So, for example, you might end up with a lot more soft mass producing species at sites where the canopy has been removed, raspberries and so on. At the same time, you might have reductions in some food types. So if you go into a site and you cut down all the large seed-producing species like oak and hickory, obviously within those harvest openings, those food resources are no longer going to be present. And insect diversity is likely to change as well, depending on what plants are available and what food resources are there. And all three of those things, of course, as I mentioned, are going to impact how wildlife can use these sites. And so that's kind of, this is sort of like a broad overview of the focus of what I've been working on here is how these changes brought about by forest management have impacted vertebrate wildlife. And up to this point, I've been kind of like just saying the words forest management, and that's obviously an incredibly broad term that could mean all kinds of different things. And as I mentioned, I'm going to focus on timber harvesting, but even that, those two words can mean all kinds of different things. And so obviously, certain types of timber harvest, like for example, this clear cut here on the left, are going to have potentially much stronger impacts on the forest ecosystem than a site that has single tree selection being conducted, where you're removing, say, one single individual tree. So you might expect that the impacts on wildlife, in this case, are going to be much greater than in that case. So to try to nail things down a little bit more cleanly, I'm going to talk about 4 different specific timber harvest treatments that I'm going to be referring back to throughout this talk. And I'm going to kind of try to define what I mean by each of them specifically. So the first one is probably the type, and I put them in rough order of most intensive to least intensive in terms of the disturbance. Of course, it's going to depend on what species is being impacted, but generally speaking. And I'm starting here with clear cuts, most intensive disturbance, and this is what the lay public often think of when they think of timber harvesting, going into an area, removing every single tree in a large area. And in Indiana, where I conducted my research, the clear cuts that we did were about 4 hectares, which is relatively small on the clear cut scale. And every tree down to, I think, about 1 centimeter DBH was removed. And this picture is pretty much right after the beginning of the summer, right after the cut happened. So there's not a lot of vegetation coming back into these sites yet. Second type of timber harvest, and the next least disturbed, is the patch cut. And patch cuts is an even more ill-defined term, I think, but in our case, what they were basically small clear cuts. So they were clear cuts that ranged in size from half a hectare to 2 hectares. And so really, in some ways, they're kind of they're going to be similar to clear cuts. The main difference is that the edge to interior area ratio is going to be different. So in the patch cuts, none of the interior is very far away from the intact forest. There's going to be stronger edge effects, or more of the area is going to have impacts from edges. Third, we have shelterwood harvesting. There's a lot of different ways you can do shelterwood harvest. The idea here is that rather than sort of creating the disturbance all at once, like you would with the clear cut, you go in and immediately remove all the trees and immediately jarringly change the conditions. You do it in several phases. So, for example, in our situation, we use 3-stage shelterwood, where you initially go in and remove the mid-story. 5 to 10 years after that, you might remove half of the remaining overstory, and then in a further 5 to 10 years, you remove the rest of the overstory. So the idea here is that if you are trying to regenerate a tree species that has an intermediate shade tolerance, like oak, for example, you might want to create intermediate light conditions. And you can do that over time by not harvesting all of the timber at once. You do it in stages. I will say that for the rest of this talk, when I refer to a shelterwood harvest, what I'm talking about is only that first stage, the mid-story removal, because I wasn't there when the rest of the phases had occurred. I think now at this point, the second phase has happened at these sites, but when I was there, it was just that mid-story removal. So that's arguably a pretty small disturbance impact. I mean, it wasn't any of the upper canopy trees that were being removed. At the same time, there was definitely more light reaching the forest floor at these sites, even with just the mid-story removed. And furthermore, they left, because of the way these harvests were conducted, they basically just left everything they cut down, so there was a lot more coarse woody debris. And I'll get more into that later. And finally, the least intensive disturbance type, arguably, that I'm going to talk about today is single tree selection, which is probably the most common type of timber harvest in the eastern U.S., at least on private land or in some public land. So in this case, basically, you're going in and you're removing individual trees. Sometimes managers will remove groups of trees. In our case, it was just one single tree at a time. And that's a pretty small disturbance, relatively speaking. It creates one tree-sized canopy gap opening, but it still is a disturbance and potentially has impact on wildlife. Okay, Okay, so given that range of disturbance events, basically what I've been interested in and what I've been working on for the past decade or so is how timber harvesting affects, how these different types of timber harvests and the sort of disturbance gradient that they're on affect different components of the forest ecosystem, specifically focused on vertebrates and how vertebrates are interacting with plants. So the two broad questions that I'm looking at here are, first of all, how does timber harvesting affect wildlife demography? So what I'm talking about here is population size and so on. And the example study I'm going to give here is looking at how those four timber harvesting types I mentioned earlier affect breeding bird abundance. And then the second question is, how does timber harvesting affect trophic interactions? So not focused so much on just numbers of things, but how changes in habitat due to disturbance might impact interaction like seed dispersal, for example, which is the one I'm going to talk about today. And that interaction in particular is important in my system because oak is a dominant canopy tree species and it is dispersed by small mammals and other vertebrates. So basically I'm going to talk about two different projects that are kind of tied together within this same system. So as Carmen mentioned, I had the great privilege of working on the Hardwood ecosystem experiment, which is, in theory at least, a 100-year study of the impacts of different forest management on many components of the forest ecosystem. So basically there's these 9 research areas which are represented on the map by the colored, by the colored blobs here. And this is like about a 30-kilometer area here. These sort of outlines here represent state forests. So this is in south central Indiana, kind of around Bloomington, if any of you are familiar with the area. And basically within each of these research cores, different management treatments were applied, and they've been monitoring all kinds of different components of the forest ecosystem since that project was initiated. So insects and plants and small mammals and birds and what else? Moths. I think there's someone doing spiders there now. Soil conditions, overstory plant conditions, understory. Basically a huge range of deer, I think, also at this point. So a whole range of things. And it was kind of motivated by the State Department of Natural Resources recently, well, in the past decade or so, ramped up their timber harvesting quite a bit in the state, and they wanted to look and see at how different approaches they might use might have different effects in the forest ecosystem. So one of the really valuable things about this study and about the experiments that I conducted specifically were the fact that we have both pre- and post-harvest data at these sites. So the project began in 2006, so obviously we're still a ways off from that 100 years. But the first harvest didn't occur until 2008, so we have multiple years of pre-harvest data at these sites. So that allowed me to, at least in the first study I'm going to talk about today, use up a pretty strong experimental design called before-after control impact design. And I made this figure here with dummy data just to illustrate what I mean by this, and this kind of will look like some figures I'm going to show you later, so hopefully it'll make them a little easier to interpret quickly. So again, fake data, but on the y-axis here we have density, say, of breeding birds or something. On the x-axis is time, and time is divided up into 2 periods, before the treatment was applied and after, and then the 2 lines represent 2 treatments, or 2 sites, one of which in the red had the treatment applied, and one in black which did not. So you can see before any treatment was applied, in this fake example, the 2 sites were very similar to each other. After the treatment was applied, they separated out, right? So that's pretty strong evidence that there is an effect of the treatment on the density of this fake bird species. If we only had the after information, we might not have as good of a picture of whether or not there was actually an effect there, right? So here we're trying to control for pre-existing differences in these sites. And obviously when you're looking at that entire map that I showed you earlier, there's no guarantee that the conditions at those 9 sites are going to be identical to each other in terms of what plants are there and what vertebrates are there. And in fact, there were great differences between them. Okay, so I'll move into the first of the 2 sections I'm going to talk about today, starting with breeding birds. And I always forget to do this before I start. Often when I'm talking about this study, I say the word we. This was an enormous study that involved like 50 technicians, and I just stepped in at the very end and grabbed the data and did the analysis and published the paper, so I deserve very little credit for this. So when I say we, I want to give the credit to the many, many people involved with collecting this data in this massive experiment. So there's a lot of different motivations for looking at breeding birds within the Hardwood Ecosystem Experiment framework. Obviously, the public is very interested in birds. There are a lot of bird watchers out there. I'd say out of all the vertebrates that we study, the public is probably the most interested in birds, and that has definitely been my experience from talking about this stuff at public meetings and such. People have very strong opinions about birds. And we have really great long-term data on birds across North America, like, for example, the North American Breeding Bird data set. That data set and others have shown there's pretty widespread population declines in a lot of species over time. And the primary reason is probably habitat loss. And there are various components to that. Development, obviously, so removal of natural habitats. The remaining habitat is going to be fragmented. But this third point is one that I think often gets overlooked, especially in the case of forest birds, and that is the maturation of existing forests. So we often think about habitat being destroyed for forest birds, but actually in a lot of states, including Indiana, where this study was conducted, the amount of forest habitat has actually increased in recent years. In fact, in Indiana, I think it's something like a 15% increase. And that's great for mature forest birds. The problem is that all of that forest is getting older. There's less and less young forest, and birds obviously have very different habitat requirements, even among the birds that we ostensibly call forest birds. And so that aging forest might be great for mature forest birds. It's not so great for early successional shrubland specialist birds. And in fact, sort of a back-of-the-envelope calculation I did indicated that something like 75% of shrubland specialist species are declining based on North American breeding bird data, which is higher than the average across all species. And even if you look past just the specialists on young forest habitat and look at species that are ostensibly mature forest birds, many of those species also use that young forest at some point in their life cycle, particularly during the post-fledging stage. So young forest habitat can be extremely valuable to the bird community. And the idea here is that perhaps in doing these timber harvests, which were mainly for forestry-related goals, we might also be creating habitat that might be valuable to the bird community. And if that's the case, then we're interested in determining which of the different harvest types that were used in this experiment were the most beneficial. So looking again at that map I showed you earlier, I'm just going to zoom in on those 3 research units up there. Put them over here on the right. So the top one is a site that has in the green single tree selection, and then in the orange are patch cuts. This site here was a control site where there wasn't any harvesting done, at least since the initiation of the study in 2006. I think it's worth emphasizing that obviously this landscape has been managed for a long time historically. So there are still going to be some lingering effects of that, even at the sites that are supposedly controls. And then finally here at the bottom is a site that has some shelterwoods here in blue and some clear cuts in red. And then black points represent locations of classic bird point counts. I'm not going to get into the details of the methodology there. It was pretty standard 10-minute point counts twice a year throughout the duration of the study, all species detected visually or auditory or recorded. And again, I personally didn't do any of that. There was an enormous army of very dedicated technicians that collected that data. So I then took that bird abundance data and converted it into basically some abundance estimates using emission models and other tools. So I'm going to skip through kind of that analysis section and jump right into the results here. And there's a lot going on with this figure, so I'll try to break it down to you here. On the y-axis here is number of species responding either positively or negatively to a given timber harvest. Again, here are the 4 timber harvests that I mentioned earlier in order. So in this case, I think 13, or maybe it's 12, I'm not sure exactly, species responded positively to the clear cut, and 5 responded negatively. It's probably kind of hard to see for most of you, but the species that are highlighted in bold are species that are often thought of as early successional or shrubland specialist species. You can see many of the species that responded positively are unexpectedly those species, but not all of them. And then the species that responded negatively typically were the mature forest birds, and often the species that were most common at these sites before the harvest occurred, like the red-eyed vireo, for example, and the ovenbird. We didn't see any species at all respond to that shelterwood harvest, either positive or negative, relative to the control. And again, that shelterwood site had only had that mid-story removal done, so it wasn't necessarily a very intensive disturbance. At the patch cut level, you can see that there was actually even more species responding both positively and negatively to the harvests. And it was kind of that same suite of species, mostly early successional specialists responding positively, and ostensibly mature forest birds responding negatively. And again, many of these species down here in this negative response were among the most common species at these sites before the harvests were applied. And then finally, single tree selection, the removal of an individual tree, didn't have an effect on either. Just for later use, I want to highlight this species right here that responded negatively, the scarlet tanager. I'm going to talk more about that one later on, but I just wanted to point out, or to remind you that this is a species that responded negatively to the clear cuts. So keep that in mind. So that's kind of like a big picture look at what happened. Obviously, there's a ton of bird species that were detected in this study, and I can't cover all of them, and I'm not an ornithologist, so I'm not going to try. But I'll highlight a few species here individually. These are all species that are of some concern in Indiana, either state species of special concern or state endangered. Particularly the cerulean warbler gets a lot of attention. So I just wanted to highlight the temporal trends for these species. So you can see the 4 species in the order there, and then they're in the same order here. These figures should look familiar. They're kind of modeled after that figure with the dummy data that I showed you earlier. On the y-axis is density, on the x-axis is time, and then the time period for each figure is divided up into 2 sections, the before and the after. And the lines represent different harvest types. So red is clear cut, orange is patch cut, blue is shelterwood, green is single tree, and the black diamond, or the black triangles are the control. So for black and white warbler, you can see that there's quite a bit of temporal variability here, which is interesting and sort of inexplicable. But there's a lot of overlap between the sites until you can see after the, after the treatment was applied, there seemed to be more separation between the treatments, and that, so in the clear cut and patch cut here at the top, the abundance was highest, and then at the bottom was the control sites. Hooded warbler, there was even more interannual variability, but it did seem like abundance was higher at the patch cut sites relative to the other treatments. For cerulean warblers, there was an interesting pattern again of increase initially and a lot of overlap before the harvests were applied. After the harvest, there was more separation. And the patch cuts and shelterwood sites had higher abundance relative to the other treatments. And then the worm-eating warbler, which is probably the most associated with mature forest out of these 4, also had the largest negative response to the more intensive harvest. You can see the abundance dropped quite a bit in the clear cuts here, and also in the patch cuts. However, I think it's worth pointing out that the y-axis here are not the same. And so even though worm-eating warbler declined here, it's still among the most common species at these sites. So looking kind of at the community level here, I have an estimate of richness in that same format. So on the x-axis is time, and the y-axis is richness. Each line represents a treatment, again with clear cut being in red. And pre-harvest, there's a lot of overlap between the sites. Post-harvest, you can see that richness in the clear cut sites increases. And basically that's like the addition of the 5 or 6 shrubland special species that were basically not present at these sites before the harvest occurred. And there does seem to be some interesting temporal trends here as well, which we'd like to explain. That hasn't been possible at this point, although we have seen similar trends in other Indiana data sets that were collected around the same time. So yeah, it's an interesting issue. So up to this point, I've been talking about the impacts of different timber harvest treatments, and that was the goal of this project that I worked on. But the ecologist in me, and probably in you, is interested in what specifically is it about these sites post-harvest that's drawing in birds. And a colleague of mine, Patrick Earl, who's now at Harding, did his dissertation at the Hardwood Ecosystem Experiment on this exact topic. Specifically within those clear-cut sites only. He basically looked at a suite of ostensibly mature forest birds and used mixed netting in these clear-cuts, and also collected a ton of vegetation structure and food availability data, insects, berries, all kinds of stuff, to try to figure out what, if anything, was drawing in mature forest birds into these openings and when they were coming in. So I'm just going to show you a snippet of the stuff he's been working on. So this figure here shows 2 different overlapping lines here. Time within 1 summer is on the x-axis, On the left y-axis is an index of rubus abundance, so raspberry abundance in black, the line is black. And scarlet tanager is red on the other side. And this is, again, only within clear cuts. So you can see that there definitely seems to be some pattern where the scarlet tanagers are moving into these sites around the time that the raspberries are becoming available. And this is kind of just a back of the envelope look at what's happening, and Patrick has done some more complicated models exploring this, and hopefully that paper will come out soon. I think it's really interesting. So looking at some broad conclusions from this from this study that I looked at the community level, habitat diversity seemed to increase the species diversity in the bird community. So a lot of these early successional species, indigo bunting, eastern coves, and these other ones, were basically totally absent at these sites before the harvest went in. So looking at the entire experiment scale, increasing habitat diversity by creating these younger forest patches or canopy openings increased the richness of the bird community. There was pretty minimal impacts of both the smaller single tree canopy gap openings and the Shelterwood harvest. And that isn't too surprising because neither of those treatments really had a major effect on the structure of those forests. At least from the bird's point of view, apparently. Looking at individual species, as we expected, we saw a pretty consistently positive response of shrubland species to harvest. Most of them increased in magnitude, or increased in number by several orders of magnitude in the harvested sites, as you'd expect. For the ostensibly mature forest species, it was more of a mixture. Some, like the worm-eating warbler and the ovenbird, definitely declined pretty significantly, although they weren't eradicated. And others, like the cerulean warbler, seem to have more of a mixed response, positive in some cases. They seem to be making use of the edges of those openings. And finally, what we've seen 8 years on, and actually a little longer now, post-harvest, it's been 10 years now. Those effects are moderating at this point, so a lot of those sites, at this point, the clear-cut sites, the tree growth is now well over my head. So these are no longer really, they don't have that clear-cut look to them anymore. They're basically dense patches of vegetation. Certainly a great habitat for some species, but a lot of those early successional species are starting to move on. We're starting to pick up the signal there as those numbers decline. And that's been shown in other studies that once you get 7 to 10 years out from the initial harvest, those early successional species start to move on. So if one of your management goals is maintaining those species on the landscape, you kind of have to continually keep recreating that early successional habitat. You can't just create it once and leave for 50 years and come back, because that habitat becomes less suitable for those species pretty quickly, relatively speaking. Okay, so that was the population demography study. Now I'm going to talk more about the trophic interaction study, and specifically looking at the process of acorn dispersal at the Hardwood ecosystem experiment. And as I mentioned briefly earlier, this was basically motivated because the overall goal of the HE, in addition to looking at impacts on forest management or on forest ecosystems, was to try to figure out the best way to regenerate oak in Indiana, which has proven very difficult. And small mammals and other dispersal agents play a big role in that oak regeneration process as dispersal agents. And so we were interested in how acorn dispersal might potentially be impacted by forest management. So small mammals are dispersal agents of acorns and other tree seeds. In this system, oaks are very dominant at this point. They're a crucial food resource for a wide variety of species, many small mammals, some birds, turkey, deer, and so on. And typically that's not a great thing for oak, right? I mean, if they're producing lots of acorns, but most of those acorns are getting eaten in any given year. However, the small mammals in particular, and also some birds like the blue jay, are scatter hoarders. So they will pick up acorns, they won't eat them immediately, they will move them somewhere else and cache them under a thin layer of soil. And so those scatter hoards or those caches aren't necessarily always recovered. It depends on environmental conditions. And in theory, those caches are potentially really great for oak because you're taking the acorn from underneath the parent tree and moving it outside the canopy and burying it under a thin layer of soil where potentially it is in a prime spot to germinate. So it's protected from other acorn predators, it's protected from desiccation. Oftentimes, these guys are smart enough to recognize whether or not a given acorn is infested with weevils, and they won't move it, so they tend to be moving the healthy acorns only. So potentially they could be beneficial from an oak's point of view. But it all comes down to whether or not acorns are ultimately escaping predation, right? Because even if they're getting scatterwooded, if they ultimately all get eaten, it doesn't matter from the oak's perspective. So for this reason, we often call these seed dispersal agents and others conditional mutualists with oak. So under some scenarios, they are, so say you have a situation where there are very few small mammals in the system, and it's a bumper crop year for acorns. This happens every once in a while. Tons of acorns in the environment, few consumers, but those squirrels and chipmunks and mice are going to methodically be scatterhoarding those acorns just the same. And so a lot of those acorns are going to go unrecovered because there's more than enough for everyone to go around, and that's going to be great for oak. On the other end of the scale, you could have a situation where the population of small mammals is very high, and it happens to be a poor mast year for oak. There aren't many acorns produced, or there's no other alternative food resources out there. And under those conditions, most acorns are ultimately going to get eaten, and in that case, small mammals are acting basically as a predation agent, and they're on the bad end of the scale. And so it's an interesting ecological situation, both from an ecology perspective and a management perspective, because obviously you're not going to get much oak regeneration in years where these seed dispersal agents are acting mainly as seed predators. So we can kind of quantify this a little more explicitly in a concept called seed dispersal effectiveness. So the higher the seed dispersal effectiveness, the better it is for the tree species in question, or for oak in this case. And I kind of already said this in a roundabout way, but small mammals are effective dispersal agents when, one, they're removing acorns from under the parent tree, and two, those removed acorns ultimately escape consumption. So you have to have both of these pieces in order for those small mammals to be having a beneficial effect. And so you can, very simply write this out mathematically as seed dispersal effectiveness equals the probability that seed is removed times the probability that survives to germinate, given that it was removed. And so what I ultimately wanted to do was to estimate this value in different harvest conditions. And I focused specifically on those Shelterwood sites. I'm not going to talk about any of the other sites, although I did explore some clear cuts a little bit. And the reason for that is that putting seeds out in the middle of clear cuts and patch cuts didn't totally make sense to me because acorns wouldn't naturally be found there because all the mature trees are gone. In the single tree selection, I didn't expect to have much of an effect. So I focused on the Shelterwood where you have this mid-story removal. And my idea is that if the habitat is being altered for small mammal seed dispersers at these Shelterwood sites, that might affect foraging behavior of those small mammals and thus potentially seed dispersal effectiveness. And the first step was to determine whether or not there was really even an effect of the Shelterwood on habitat that's relevant for small mammals. So I pulled data from another study I did on small mammals. And in this figure, each column represents a habitat characteristic that might be relevant to small mammals. So herbaceous cover in the first column, woody cover in the second column, and coarse woody debris in the final column. And then the top row are control sites, the bottom row Shelterwood sites, and then each bar represents 1 year, again divided by when the harvest was applied at the dotted line. So you can see at the control sites there's certainly interannual variability, but there's not a strong pattern there. At the Shelterwood sites, we definitely saw an increase in herbaceous cover and woody cover over time at these Shelterwood sites, and some signal of an increase in coarse woody debris as well. And like that, to me, there's definitely an increase in coarse woody debris because, like I said earlier, when they cut down trees in the mid-story, they left them there. So there had to be more trees on the ground at those Shelterwood sites typically. So it does seem like there's some changes in habitat that might be relevant from a small mammal's perspective because certainly white-footed mice in these systems, eastern chipmunks, and some of the time the gray squirrels in this system are all running around on the ground looking for fallen acorns. So here's the basic study design. I had 5 oak trees in Shelterwood sites and 5 in control sites. Zooming in on one of these individual trees, underneath each tree I placed 2 exclosure boxes. And one box allowed access to only mice and chipmunks, but the mesh was such that squirrels could not get into it. And then the other one, mice, chipmunks, and squirrels had access to it, but it excluded larger seed predators like turkey and deer. And then in the fall of each year of the study, I provisioned each of these exclosure boxes with 100 white oak and 100 black oak. acorns collected at these sites originally. And each of these acorns was meticulously tagged with an individual nail. So the exact nail type differed, but it corresponded to A, the species of acorn, and B, the exposure type it came from. And this method of tracking acorns has been used frequently in the literature. The nice thing is that small mammals aren't bothered by it, or they don't seem to be bothered by it, so they don't seem to behave any differently in the presence of that tag. And furthermore, they will not consume the tag, which is obviously good. But it allows us to figure out what the ultimate fate of the acorn was, because if we find the acorn with the tag in it, then the acorn has survived. If we find just the tag, or the tag plus some remnants, as we often did, that indicated that the acorn had been consumed. And so, in the spring, after these acorns have been out for several months, we returned to the site. We went back to the exclosures and counted up how many acorns were left or hadn't been taken, which was usually a few. And then we used a metal detector and meticulously searched a 40 by 40 meter area around this tree, which was as fun as it sounds. Using a metal detector in like a forest covered with thorns and close-woody debris. But it definitely was possible. We did recover a lot of acorns. And so you can see in this picture here, this was an example of a tag that we recovered without an acorn in it, and then an example of a recovered acorn that had a tag in it. So using this experimental structure, we were able to estimate those two pieces of the seed dispersal effectiveness equation. So we got probability of removal based on how many seeds were left over in these boxes after the winter was over. And we got probability of survival given removal using the metal detector by looking at how many seeds were in each of these conditions after we recovered them. So here are the results of that study, and I've broken this out in a bunch of different ways for reasons I'll explain in a second. So on the y-axis is seed dispersal effectiveness, and it ranges, well, from here from 0 to 0.6, but the maximum values are 0 and 1, because that's you're multiplying two probabilities together. Each panel here is a separate year of the study. I've only put some of the years here just for space. And then each panel is split in half by which exposure type it was. So these panels, squirrels did not have access. These panels, they did. And then it's further divided up by acorn species, black oak and white oak. And then the two colors represent the two treatments. So black is the control and blue is the corresponding shelterwood. So you can see that under most conditions, there was a decline in seed dispersal effectiveness in the shelterwood sites relative to the control sites for any given pairing of year and exposure type and acorn species. The main exception to that was 2013 here, where basically seed dispersal effectiveness was 0 across the board. And that happened to be a year that corresponded with a very high small mammal abundance and very low acorn production. So the ratio of seeds to consumers was pretty low. And so basically, I put out a feast for these poor small mammals that were desperate, and they just ate everything. So that's why there's basically no signal there. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's important to not pool all this information together, because the behavior of the dispersal agents is going to vary a ton depending on the environmental conditions. But you can see that there was a pretty consistent pattern here. So in a little bit, I'll talk about why I think that was happening at these sites. And so that was kind of more the ecology side of the question. How is seed dispersal changing? How is potentially foraging behavior changing? But I also, part of my dissertation was management impacts or management effects of these patterns. And so it seems like SDE for oak was lower in the shelterwood harvest. The question is, does that reduction actually pan out into any change on oak regeneration success, right? Because from a manager's point of view, that's all they really care about, is whether or not that change in seed dispersal effectiveness has any ultimate impact on oak regeneration. Because they're not going to want to hear that shelterwood harvests, which are probably the best way in Indiana to regenerate oak, are having this unintended negative effect on oak regeneration. So obviously you could do this, or you could try to do this study empirically by tracking the fate of all these acorns over a long period of time as they grew into saplings. I didn't have that time in my dissertation, so I didn't do that, although I think it would be very interesting. So what I did instead was to build an individual-based model of basically the entire oak life cycle, but focused specifically on early oak life history from the time that the acorn was produced until the time that it became a sapling. And I defined a sapling as a tree that had reached a height where it had basically escaped the worst of the deer herbivory. And I'm not going to go into detail about this model because there's no time, but basically we were modeling or tracking individual acorns all the way through their early oak life history as they're infested by insects, as they are falling to the ground, as they are being dispersed by small mammals, as they are being recovered or not recovered, germinating into seedlings, being exposed to different amount of light depending on how many competitors they have, growing into a sapling, and then eventually growing into a mature tree. And so, because I had complete control of this system, which, as I've noted here, was parameterized using a variety of studies that I conducted and the literature, we can create different scenarios. And so I created a scenario in which the effect of Shelterwood harvest on seed dispersal effectiveness didn't exist, and another scenario in which it did. And then I compared those two modeling scenarios to see whether or not there was any ultimate impact on the end result of oak regeneration. So just for fun, I've illustrated here what the simulation looked like. So this is basically a top-down look at it, and the darker greens represent denser canopies. So you can kind of see the larger tree canopies here in circles. The different colors represent different mature trees. And then underneath this canopy here are untold numbers of saplings and seedlings and acorns. And so this example here is just kind of what a simulated Shelterwood harvest looked like. So you'll see multiple phases happening here of harvest over time, but it happens pretty quickly. So that was one phase, there's another phase, and then at some point, all of the remaining overstory trees were removed. So obviously I have complete control over what's happening in the system, and at the same time I can count up the numbers of trees in all of these different categories. So that's what I presented here. Again, I mentioned there were two different scenarios. One where Shelterwood harvesting doesn't affect dispersal, which again was not what I observed in the field, and then another one where it does. And I used two metrics of oak regeneration. The first one was focused on the earliest part of the life history, so the number of new seedlings produced, so germination basically. And then the second one was looking a little further down the line at saplings, how many saplings were present after a certain amount of time. And this one's probably the one that's a little more interesting to managers. So what you can see is initially there was a difference between these two scenarios, indicating that change in seed dispersal effectiveness in Shelterwoods was having potentially a detrimental impact on oak regeneration success. However, over time, as you move up to the sapling life history or life stage, that difference basically disappears. And what I think is happening there is basically other biotic filters are acting within the simulation, specifically competition for light and herbivory. And those are more important at the final stages for driving how many saplings are produced. So you see an effect initially, but in the long run, it probably doesn't matter. And this isn't too shocking because, you know, there was a change in seed dispersal effectiveness, but it wasn't like this giant change. And it varied between years and among acorn type and so on. So some broad conclusions from this study. Looking more on the ecology side, Shelterwood harvests seem to affect acorn dispersal. They reduce seed dispersal effectiveness, and I didn't break it down like this before, but basically the components of that were acorn removal were higher, so the probability of removal was higher in Shelterwoods, so more seeds were being removed at those sites, but those seeds that were removed had much lower survival. And so if you multiply the two together, the result was that seed dispersal effectiveness was lower in the Shelterwoods. And both of these things would indicate to me that these animals are spending more time foraging, or they're able to forage more efficiently. And I don't know the exact reasons for that because I didn't track individual squirrels. That would be a very interesting study, I think, but it was outside the scope of what I did. It's possible that the increase in understory cover at these Shelterwood sites was possibly giving them a little more protection from aerial predators than they had at the control sites. And if they felt that there's predation risk, they might be having greater foraging efficiency. And obviously, I'm going out on a limb with these things. I didn't test predation risk. I didn't use giving up densities or anything. I think that would be a pretty interesting topic for a future project. However, even though we did see this effect initially of reduced seed dispersal effectiveness in Shelterwoods, at least based on the simulation model, it didn't seem like that had any ultimate impact on oak regeneration. The number of saplings wasn't really affected by whether or not there was that reduction in seed dispersal effectiveness. It seemed like other factors, most likely light availability, were driving that pattern ultimately. And so shelterwoods, of course, are going to continue to be a good option in many cases for oak regeneration because they are increasing the light available at the forest floor for these oaks. So kind of take home here, summing up both studies, timber harvesting has potentially both numeric and behavioral effects on wildlife, and given that, indirect impacts and forest management goals are possible, although the example I showed here indicated that for the ultimate regeneration success, it might not be so important. So with that, I would like to thank my many collaborators, specifically Rob, Patrick, Barney, and Nate Lichty, many technicians, as I mentioned before, both technicians working on the bird study and the Acorn dispersal study, the heat coordinators and the executive committee, and all of our heat partners, particularly the Indiana DNR, for making this study possible. So with that, I will try to take any questions you have. Thank you.
Before we start questions, I forgot to tell everyone that I'll bring Ken over to Nick's afterwards, per usual. He'll migrate gradually there, if he's willing. I haven't talked to him about that, but...
Now that you put me on the spot.
I'm also super pissed that I didn't get a shout out for being a technician. Shelter retrieval.
Wait, were you in the Acorn dispersal study?
No, but I created the shelter.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, okay.
Held
Sorry.
trees
Yes. Carmen, I should have pointed it out. Carmen cut down some of those mid-story trees. She fixed the horrible job that the timber company did. Yeah. I forgot about that. Yeah.
So for your model, what were your inputs for those like other bionic factors, like the increased light and stuff like that, that would aid in helping to establish the sapling?
You mean like how did I model the light availability process?
Yeah.
I mean, it was obviously simplified to a certain extent, but it was basically based on, so each tree had, based on how tall the tree was, it had a canopy of a certain width, right? Based on data that we collected at these sites, the height canopy width ratio, and it shaded everything that was shorter than it. So that's where the simplification happens, right? It's because the canopy's, a vertical structure, but I didn't have the computing power to simulate that. So we estimated some, some percentage of the light that was moving through the canopy, depending on how large the tree was, and then basically stacked up all the trees as you went down until you reached, the seedlings and saplings at the forest floor, basically. So that's how we calculated it. And is it a gross simplification? Absolutely, but it's what we used here.
And that was like before and after, so you knew like how much light availability before the Shelterwood.
Yeah, right. So it was being calculated for each tree at each time, right? And then, so I was modeling the growth of the seedlings and saplings based on how much light they had available to them, which was based on actual seedlings that I had out at these sites, like their growth rate based on how shaded they were.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. How the growth, so that, I think there was a decent amount of realism up to the sapling stage, and past that, I was playing faster and looser with the growth rates. I was using one of the old school Jaboa type models for that, because I didn't have any data on like the growth rate of intermediate sized and mature trees. So I was just making guesses based on what was out in the literature.
For the bird plots, based on the point counts, it seemed like a lot of times you had an increase in birds of different species before the treatment effect, and I think you mentioned you had some idea about that.
Yeah, there was some before. The initial spike right before that one is tough to explain. I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure. Like I said, I wasn't involved in those years of the study, so I'm not sure if if I'd been there, if there'd been some obvious explanation for that.
Do you think it could have been observer effects?
Yeah, there's a chance. I mean, when I modeled this, I included observer effects in the detection process, so I tried to parse that out as much as I could, but I was limited in a sense. I think there's also, we kind of treated these sites as if they were, at least the research cores, we treated as if they were independent entities from each other, but that's not really the case with birds, right? They're easily traveling potentially between the sites. And so they might be increasing in abundance at one, but they're spilling over into an adjacent control site or whatever, and that's masking some of the effects. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely limitations to that approach.
I'm like relieved on behalf of the foresters that there's no, like the difference in seed dispersal effectiveness doesn't seem to matter between those treatments. But I'm like trying to think about what that means for like negative density dependence. And do you ever get yelled at by Jansen Connell people that feel really confidently that seed dispersal should matter a lot?
I mean, I don't think it doesn't matter. I just think that the magnitude of the effect that I measured doesn't matter. At least in conjunction with the benefits provided by these Shelterwood sites in terms of increased light availability. So I did a bunch of sensitivity analyses on this model, and it came out that the parameter that the model was most sensitive to was that, the parameter that measured the survival of a seed in a cache, given that it had been cached. So obviously, at least based on my simulations, that parameter is very important. I just don't think what I observed in the field was enough to shift it. And again, like, it's a simulation with crude metrics, and it's hard for me to say whether or not these sapling oaks were necessarily in the most, they might not have been in the perfect competitive state even if they reached that height. Or I wasn't really doing anything super sophisticated in terms of determining whether or not they were the most likely species in that spot to become the mature tree in that spot, right? So, yeah, I don't think I'm making any super strong conclusion there in terms of the importance of dispersal. Obviously, it has to be important at some level because otherwise all the acorns would just fall under the mature tree and they would all die, right? So, yeah.
What are the invasive species in Indiana that you're concerned about?
So autumn olive and at these sites actually there wasn't much. These sites did not have an invasive a major invasive understory layer because the sites that we were working in were pretty interior forest sites, and they were sites that had been managed by the DNR for a long time. So I didn't really have invasive issues. Although now that there's all these researchers tramping around in there, I don't know if that might long-term cause issues. I think things might have been totally different if there had been a layer of something there blocking. It might not matter what the Shelterwood effects were in that case because there'd already be some dense understory layer, of shade-tolerant invasives that were providing that protection from predators anyway. So that would be an interesting question, but it wasn't a situation we had at these sites.
Let's thank Ken.
They actually have an option for student, full-time student, you get resident benefit.
Well, it was mainly half. It was postdocs. Yeah.
Now he's by 2 year, by 2 year resident. My last year, yeah, I had resident license. I had nobody ever said it.
That's like another reason I was like, I have to keep my I'm like, now I just feel like someone's like pushing your chest in.
But yeah, I would bring 50. Please get.
I see him all the time, bro. We're all alone, man.
Yeah, what's that mean?
So we weren't allowed to be alone together.
I've been alone a lot today. Hopefully it's not still recording.
Hopefully it's not. I'm trying to figure out how to turn the lights off. So, well, it's here. So, lighting.
There you go. One more. One more.
No, okay, so these don't ever turn off.
Okay.
Those are always on. Turn the main. Yeah, I think everything's good at that point. I don't think nothing seems like it's recording. No, I didn't mean to press it. I'm sorry.
Jared.
Do you think a lot of people are going in there?
I don't know.
Or we just sneak out? I'd rather go tonight.
Huh?
I'd rather go tonight.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I thought you meant like. Yeah. Take notes on like what I remember from school. Also, how does Brandon know it?
Oh, it's like such a big, like, Purdue standing here. Like, Bridget knows Carmen from Purdue. And, like, they all know each other from Purdue. Everybody. Like, think about it, like, John's here now, and he was at Purdue, and Carmen, and
Yes.